I'm DeLacy Ganley, the Dean here at the School of Educational Studies here at Claremont Graduate University. Welcome. Thank you for being with us today to mark the 50th anniversary of the seminal court case, Lau versus Nichols, the class action suit brought by a group of non-English speaking Chinese students of the San Francisco Unified School District. It is through this case that we recognize there is no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. There must also be access to those resources in a language that the student comprehends. As so simply and beautifully stated on the U.S. Department of Education's website, we know that those who do not understand English are certain to find their classroom experiences wholly incomprehensible and in no way meaningful if little to no attempt is made to connect to the student's language. If one reads about the case, you will see reference to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and for good reason. We cannot have full civil rights without having language rights. That education is a civil rights is something that we talk a lot about here at Claremont Graduate University. We are a mission-driven school, and our mission is to promote wellness in individuals, institutions, communities, and society. We prepare individuals to foster excellence, equity, and innovation in the educational and nonprofit institutions that are at the heart of our communities and that are a bedrock of a democratic society. For us, a concern with justice, diversity, and inclusion and equity is not a new concern. We have a historical connection to these ideals, and our commitments run deep. As an external review team recently put it, a concern for Jedi issues is baked into our DNA. And this is why I was so excited when Dr. Oscar Jimenez-Castellanos approached me about doing today's webinar. Hats off to Oscar for leading the charge and spearheading today's webinar. Dr. Jimenez-Castellanos is a senior research fellow here at CGU's School of Educational Studies. He's a nationally recognized scholar of educational policy and finance equity, as well as Latinx educational research. An alum of CGU, he has advanced discussions at some of the nation's most esteemed institutions, including the Education Trust, the University of Southern California, Cal Berkeley, and Arizona State University. Oscar started his career as a bilingual school teacher. Oscar, we are proud of you and cheer the meaningful contributions you are making. Here at CGU, we care a lot about partnerships. We know we can accomplish more when we work together. It is in this spirit of kindred collaboration that I acknowledge and thank this event's co-sponsors, including San Diego State University's Center for Equity and Biliteracy Educational Research, Loyola Marymount University's Center for Equity for English Learners, Arizona State University's Children's Equity Project, NABE, the National Association for Bilingual Educators, CABE, the California Association for Bilingual Education, California Together, and the Intercultural Development Research Association. Indeed, what a wonderful group of colleagues to be associated with. There are also a number of CGU graduate students and CGU staff who have been instrumental behind the scenes. Thankful shout outs go to Mariano Lozano Soto, Monique Posadas, Stephanie Vasquez, Chasta Jefferson, Dominique Acosta, Cynthia Liu, and Sunny Chow. As I think about the names of the students that I've just read, I beam with pride. We have so many students who are advancing research around educational policy, multilingualism, and financial equity. If anyone here in the greater audience is interested in supporting these students and their research, please connect with me. I'll send you a link in the chat. The stars of the webinar are indeed the panelists who are sharing their expertise and perspectives. There are too many to name in total, but I want to acknowledge their critical contributions at the onset. Thank you. Again, welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here today. Without further ado, I pass the puck to webinar mastermind, Dr. Oscar Castellanos, to get us started. Oscar?
Thank you, Dean Ganley, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar, Lau v. Nichols 50th anniversary. It's been 50 years since this court case was successfully tried to preserve the language rights of what we call English learners or multilingual students. So it's a pleasure to recognize this occasion, but knowing that this promise of meaningful instruction or access to meaningful instruction and equitable access to multilingualism is unfortunately unfulfilled and incomplete until this moment. So although it's been 50 years, there's still a lot of work to be done collectively. So I want to thank Dean Ganley. I also want to thank the Assistant Deputy Secretary, Montserrat Garibay, who will be introduced in a moment by Dean Ganley. I want to thank the distinguished panelists who have joined us and contributed their expertise and their time, our amazing co-sponsors who also advocate on behalf of multilingual learner students every single day, which the Dean has already highlighted specifically. I also want to sort of acknowledge that or outline a little bit of the logistics of today. We will have a keynote presentation by the Assistant Deputy Secretary and Director of the Office of English Language Acquisition, Montserrat Garibay, followed by a panel of our esteemed distinguished scholars and advocates and superintendents, one focused on legislation and advocacy, and the second focused on how do we move from policy to practice. After that, we will give some concluding remarks and end the webinar. But before we do that, I just want to say a few more remarks. One is that although Lau happened 50 years ago, I would argue that it's more relevant today than it was 50 years ago. We have over 5 million what are labeled English learners or multilingual learner students across the United States. 3.75 of them are Spanish speaking, but we also have a high percentage of Arabic, Chinese, Vietnamese, and a multitude of languages. I also want to recognize that language rights is part of our historical fabric that has been a struggle since the inception of this country with our Native American brothers and sisters that have been in this struggle for a very long time. I also want to make a connection with the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education that's also being celebrated this year with our Black brothers and sisters as well, looking at issues of civil rights and segregation and desegregation in this country. Like Brown, Lau is sufficient, I would argue, is needed but insufficient so far. However, it is part of this larger fabric that has, as the Dean said, the Civil Rights Project. So I also want to acknowledge the work done by advocates in the community of the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, and also the Castañeda v. Picard case of 1981, which I'm sure will be referenced throughout this panel. Lastly, I want to thank Ileana Najarro and Mark Walsh at EdWeek, who published a couple great articles on this topic on Friday. So if you haven't checked them out, I highly recommend them. So again, thank you. This webinar is being recorded. It is live streamed. So thank you again for joining us today and look forward for an enriching conversation. I'll pass it back to Dean Ganley to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Oscar. It is with honor that I introduce Montserrat Garibay as our keynote. Ms. Garibay is currently the Assistant Deputy Secretary and Director for the Office of English Language Acquisition at the U.S. Department of Education. Montserrat, please pass on our collective cheer for the Raising the Bar initiative. I would bet the majority of us here today agree with the U.S. Department of Education that being bilingual is a superpower. Prior to her work at the U.S. Department of Education, Montserrat was the Secretary-Treasurer of the Texas American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations and served as Vice President for Certified Employees with Education Austin. An activist on education and immigrant issues, Montserrat came to the U.S. from Mexico City as an undocumented immigrant and became a citizen 20 years later. She has been instrumental in promoting opportunities for all students, including those from immigrant families. She promoted passage of the Texas version of the DREAM Act and comprehensive immigration reform. A bilingual pre-kindergarten teacher for 8 years and a national board certified teacher, she's a graduate of Cornell University and a master's degree graduate from the University of Texas, Austin. Thank you for being with us here today, Montserrat.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Dr. DeLacy, for your introduction. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the 50th anniversary of the U.S. Supreme Court Lau versus Nichols event today here at the Claremont Graduate University. Mi nombre es Montserrat Garibay y soy la vicesecretaria adjunta y directora de la Oficina de Adquisición del Idioma Inglés del Departamento de Educación de los Estados Unidos. This month, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Lau versus Nichols. And Lau versus Nichols was a class action suit brought by parents of non-English proficient Chinese students against the San Francisco Unified School District. In 1974, the Supreme Court ruled that identical education does not constitute equal education under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The court ruled that the district must take affirmative steps to overcome educational barriers faced by non-English speaking Chinese students in the district. Now, the Office of Civil Rights is responsible for enforcing the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. In Lau versus Nichols, the Supreme Court affirmed the Department of Education's May 25, 1970 memorandum that directed school districts to take steps to help English learner students to overcome language barriers and to ensure that they can participate meaningfully in the district's educational programs. Now, school districts in many parts of our country are experiencing a substantial increase in the enrollment of national origin minority students who cannot speak, read, or write English well enough to participate meaningfully in educational programs without appropriate support services. In the absence of specific steps to address the language-related limitations experienced by such students, these students are at risk of losing the educational opportunities provided to students generally. Now, with that in mind, let's continue to welcome all students whose first language is not English into our communities and schools. And let's look at their heritage language as assets. Our beautiful country has over 350 languages spoken. Let's embrace that as an asset and a superpower, as Secretary Cardona says. The fact is that the number of people who speak a language other than English has tripled in recent decades. Being multilingual allows us to compete in the global economy, have better jobs, higher pay, and stronger creativity and problem-solving skills. This is a reminder that there are laws and policies already in place to ensure our English learner students receive the education that they need in the way that they need it in order to be successful in our schools. Now, state and local education agencies must meet their obligation when serving them. Let's also remember the spirit of our leadership has to go beyond the letter of the law. Lau versus Nichols should not be seen as the bare minimum we should expect for our English learners. We should, in the contrary, raise the bar and expect more and better outcomes for our students. You have a president who understands the power of education to help our nation compete and lead the world. You have a bilingual Secretary of Education who was an English learner himself. And you have a Department of Education that is fighting every day to advance multilingual education and support of our English learners. In closing, yes, let's celebrate this important milestone today, but let's keep raising the bar for our most precious assets, our students, the future of our country. And thank you to everyone that has worked tirelessly for me personally to be here, speaking in English as an English learner, as your Assistant Deputy Secretary at the Department of Education. This is just one example of the importance of our English learners receiving the education that they need when they need it in the way that they need it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Assistant Deputy Secretary Garibay. Thank you very much, Dean Ganley. I would like to now invite panel number 1 to come on stage. And we will begin the conversation with our panelists. So the way that I will be moderating this conversation. We will I will ask questions to each panelist. They will have about 5 minutes to respond to each of these initial questions, and then there will be follow-up questions and conversation with the panelists. So I will go ahead and begin immediately with Ed Steinman. Ed, you serve as a faculty in the Santa Clara University Law School for many years. However, you were a young lawyer, 25, 26 years old, when you took on the Lau case as the lead plaintiff lawyer. How did you feel when that happened? Can you tell us about the successful legal argument that you made? We've been mentioning the concept of access to meaningful instruction. Is there a legal definition? What are your thoughts about the effectiveness of the Lau remedies that followed after the Lau ruling and any other post-Lau civil rights litigation related to language rights? And lastly, what is the legacy of Lau, if any, in your opinion? Ed?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I really don't want to talk about history that much. I was a lawyer. I had clients who had sweatshop wage problems. They had consumer problems, domestic problems. And I found out their kids were just in classes where they didn't understand what the hell was going on. 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 36 weeks a year. And the lawsuit, the premise is essentially interesting. It's sort of the opposite side of the coin of the Brown case, which I mentioned already. Brown was about taking people who are the same and treating them unequally. Well, the Lau case, which you also see, of course, with children with disabilities, is the opposite. It's taking kids who are different and treating them the same. But that sameness doesn't give them benefit. To the extent that we're talking about meaningful instruction, the court has left it to basically the legislatures, federal and the state. They've left it to the school districts to decide how much. To me, it's not meaningful if the child does not understand the language of the teacher. But I will definitely admit that you don't have a requirement that the Lau remedy be bilingual. But what I want to spend most of my time on is what's happened in the last 50 years. And I don't want to be a downer, but I want to say that the issue is not an education issue, although most of you attending this webinar are doing wonderful things trying to develop notions of equity, bilingual education. The issue is not a legal issue. Lau was in the books. It's been there 50 years. We've had Lau remedies which have come and gone. We've had some states which had, like California, very aggressive Lau type of statutes which come and gone. But the real problem is political and attitudinal. And let me share with you a quote. What I'm going to be now for 30 seconds is a law professor. I apologize. That's what I've been for most of my adult life. U.S. Supreme Court gets requests to hear this recently 9,000 cases. Given my politics, I wish they would take none, but that's not the issue. They took the Lau case. If it was not one of the 100 cases taken that year, they now take 70 cases. The decision of the federal appellate court, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, California, Arizona, Nevada, other Western states, would have been the law in that circuit and would have been not binding, but dispositive for the rest of the country. This is a sentence from that decision, 1973, overruled in Lau, but I submit to you, not overruled in the minds and hearts of too many Americans. Quote, the discrimination allegedly suffered by these children is not the result of laws enacted by the state presently or historically, but is the result of deficiencies created by the children themselves in failing to learn the English language. That's not the law, but I submit to you that may be what too many Americans feel. We have seen that Lau, if you want to implement it, can be wonderful. California, if you look at most of the cities on the West Coast, they have very good Lau programs. But we know throughout the country, including in this state and in the Inner Valley, that there are millions of English learners, the 5 million Lau kids they used to be called, who are not getting it. Now, why are they not getting it? Well, there's a host of reasons offered. The parents don't want it. We don't know how to do it. We don't have the teachers. It costs too much money. Now, there is some validity to some of those reasons. But I submit to you the major reason it has not been done is because school districts don't want to do it. Now, why don't they want to do it? Well, at the risk of being offensive to some of you, and I was a tenured law professor for 35 years, I think the problem is the teachers. When I went to school, I was the normal type of kid. Kids are different now. They don't look like me. They have differences. And yet, basically, teachers have seniority. They have tenure. I don't blame them for not wanting to retrain. I don't blame them for not wanting to look for the job. But what's become very clear to me over the last 50 years is we educate kids. We have schools to educate students not to pay my salary. And I think some of the resistance has been because we need to find more money because we can't deal with the faculty we have. I submit to you that bilingual education or whatever else you're going to do does not, except at the start, cost more money. You have the same number of kids, the same number of teachers. If anything, you have shrinking enrollments in many public schools. It doesn't cost more money, it costs reallocating money. And I make this comment because in my 50 years, and the gray hair is real, I don't add it, is that it's a political issue. And to me, the most frustration is that if we had school districts which reflected the type of people, racial, national origin, whatever, in the school board, you wouldn't need Lau. As the assistant secretary said, Lau is a floor. You can do anything you want if you really believe in bilingual education, if somehow you really believe in ESL, whatever it is. You can do anything you want if you want to. And to me, if I had my life to do over again, which I don't believe in, I don't have any religion that says that, I would want to spend my time on voting to make sure that if we can get the right people, whether it's at the local district, the state legislature, whatever, then you wouldn't need webinars like this. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Ed. Provocative statements, interesting insight from the plaintiff lead lawyer, Ed Steinman. Now we're going to turn to Selena Moreno. Selena, you are a former MALDEF lawyer, currently serve as the president and CEO of IDRA, a national nonprofit organization that for 50 years, no coincidence maybe, has been dedicated to educational justice. IDRA was involved in the Lau Remedies. What can you tell us about the effectiveness of the remedy implementation in Texas, where IDRA is housed, but beyond as a national organization? IDRA has also been at the forefront of school funding for bilingual education and English learners, multilingual students in general. Funding is important to be able to provide that access to meaningful instruction. Where are we at with adequately and equitably funding multilingual learners in the United States? What federal and/or state policy, what should federal and state policymakers consider? Selena?
Thank you, Oscar, for having me and for putting together this group of people. And it's really great to see my friend, Assistant Deputy Secretary Garibay, who I got to know when we were advocates fighting alongside during several grueling Texas legislative sessions. What an honor as well to learn from Ed Steinman, a hero to our civil rights legal community. And as Oscar mentioned, my name is Selena Moreno. I'm the president and CEO of IDRA. IDRA, or IDRA, is a national nonprofit organization that, yes, for 50 years has advocated educational justice, including and especially language rights. And it is our core belief at IDRA that students should not have to abandon their home language in order to succeed in school. I think that some have the mistaken belief that a student's language makes for student underachievement. Rather, underfunded schools, bad policies, and inadequate educational practices make for underachieving students. IDRA's founder, Dr. José Cárdenas, who testified in Lau v. Nichols, argued that when the characteristics of students were incompatible with the characteristics of the instructional program, it was incumbent upon the school to adapt to be compatible with the students, not for the students to change their characteristics. Our very own Dr. Jose and Dr. Bambi Cárdenas served as consultants to DOJ's Civil Rights Division in preparing a brief presented to the Supreme Court by J. Stanley Pottinger, who argued on behalf of the plaintiffs alongside Mr. Steinman during oral argument. The Lau decision affirmed Dr. Cárdenas's theory of incompatibilities and was followed by the establishment of a Lau task force by the Office for Civil Rights, or OCR. Dr. Cárdenas served on the task force which developed the guidelines now known as the Lau Remedies for schools to follow in complying with the Lau decision, and they were distributed by OCR to all state education agencies. And for background, IDRA operated one of the first federal desegregation assistance centers to help school districts comply with the new decision. So what is the state of affairs today with respect to the Lau Remedies? Well, the Lau Remedies and their progeny changed the game for emergent bilingual students, and I think they're as relevant as ever as the population of those students has soared in U.S. schools. So Texas public schools, for example, serve the greatest number of emergent bilingual students in the country, now accounting for 23% of the pre-K through 12 population, or over 1.2 million students. California is just behind Texas at 19%, or 1.1 million emergent bilingual students. I'll focus a little bit on Texas, my home state, where IDRA was founded and where we helped draft and pass the first bilingual education laws. So Texas law requires school districts right now to offer bilingual education if at least 20 students in the same grade level speak a language other than English. And bilingual education, not just ESL, is required to be offered in grades K through 6. There's a couple of exceptions. But fast forward to the present, Texas just rolled out a strategic plan for emergent bilingual students learning and a dual language framework that's being touted as a national model. So all that said, I think I agree with what's been said already. We have a long way to go to ensure equitable opportunities for emergent bilingual students. Those students still don't graduate college ready at the same rates as their peers. So 33% of emergent bilingual students versus 53% of all Texas students. And when we think about funding, there have been some recent gains in funding for dual language programs, which generally have good outcomes. However, in a state like Texas, the important thing to note is that only about 20% of emergent bilingual students actually participate in dual language programs, whereas the vast majority, about 80%, participate in ESL or other types of bilingual programs. And so strengthening dual language programs cannot be done at the expense of enforcing the civil rights of all emergent bilingual students. So strengthening dual language programs is necessary, but not sufficient. So what does funding look like for non-dual language programs? As Oscar mentioned, I was an attorney at MALDEF, and in each of MALDEF's Texas school funding cases, IDRA served as expert witness on issues of language rights of students. And our research showed that unfortunately, Texas has not made much progress here despite advocates' efforts. The Texas weighted funding system still funds bilingual education at one of the lowest levels in the country, just 10% above base funding, much, much lower than what we know that the research shows it actually costs to meet the needs of our emergent bilingual students. And that weight has not been revisited since 1984. So you think about how long ago that was. Mullets were in style then, long time ago, and completely neglecting of those students. The low weight means even less funding, considering that Texas ranks 41st in student funding. And that means that funding for emergent bilingual students is inadequate at its base and inequitable in any additional funding. So states neglect these students at their own peril, and I look forward to today's conversation and to learning from the great minds on this webinar. I look forward especially to continuing our fight for years to come to honor the legacy of Lau. Thank you for having me here again.
Thank you, Selena. I want to remind the audience, the participants, that there is a Q&A. I do see a question there. Be patient in terms of a response. When one of the panelists has an opportunity, feel free to check and respond to any of those questions. Next, we'll go to Chantel Meek. Chantel, you are a former senior advisor for the U.S. Department of Education in the Obama administration, and currently the executive director of the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University, a multi-university initiative that aims to close opportunity gaps between children from historically marginalized communities and their peers. In particular, young learners. And young learners are largely left out of civil rights protections. So questions. How should advocates and policymakers be thinking, including protections for early learners and their families? You also live in the state of Arizona. This is the state of the Horn v. Flores case that originated in the early 2000s. Arizona is going through a deja vu moment, if you will, with Tom Horn back as the superintendent of public education. What are federal and state levers available and or needed to help against attacks on multilingual learners, students, and children that are happening in Arizona and other places across the country?
Thank you, Oscar. Humbled to be a part of this incredible panel and this work along with everybody else here. So I'll start with the first question on early learners. So we're here reflecting on the gains and the shortfalls, right, of this ruling, how much is done, how much we have yet to go. But as you mentioned, right, when we think about little kids, those before kindergarten, they actually don't have any protections. They don't have any rights to education at all, with the exception of kids with disabilities. And especially not to high quality dual language education, right? When we think about even the more narrow piece. As most of you probably know, the U.S. is the only UN state that has not ratified the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. So that is our baseline, and we build the rest of the inequities on this country from that baseline. So it's a challenge for all kids, but kids from historically marginalized communities who face the greatest gaps in access to resources and opportunity are hit the hardest, and that includes our emerging bilingual young children. So this is problematic for lots of reasons, and I'm going to review just really briefly kind of these main pieces of research, right? The first is because they are young children and they are people and they deserve the right to learn and be authentically them in the language that they speak and that they are most comfortable with. But we also know that there's decades and decades and decades now of research that indicate that access to high quality early education is associated with every outcome you can imagine, right? Education outcomes, health outcomes, earnings, so on and so forth. We also know that early neuroscience, another body of research adjacent to kind of the education space, indicate that the first 5 years of life, the very years in which kids really have no rights to high quality learning or education or opportunities, let alone bilingual ones, which we know are best practice, are some of the most sensitive and malleable and consequential years in brain development across the entire life course, right? This is especially true for language development. And we've known this for a really long time, right? In 2000, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine published Neurons to Neighborhood, right? This groundbreaking study that's now almost a quarter of a century old, that really looked at the importance of the early years and investments in the early years. The Center for the Developing Child at Harvard published this really just stark map where they kind of chart out language development over the course of the life course and childhood. And there's just like sharp slope, right, in the early years where it really peaks. And if any of you have kids, have grandkids, know kids, have worked with kids, right, you know when that language explosion happens during toddlerhood, during those preschool years, during those years before kindergarten, right? There's another body of research that's been alluded to already, right, on the science of bilingualism, the very already established benefits of bilingualism that are cognitive, that are academic, that are earning, that are even health outcomes, right? So the science there is settled. Bilingualism's good. That's not really a topic of debate. But what does it mean, right, when we put all these pieces together for our youngest emerging bilingual kids? About the opportunities that we're denying them by lacking culturally sustaining dual language opportunities in the earliest years. It means that one of the biggest and often overlooked shortfalls of language rights for ELs in this space is really the neglect of our youngest emerging bilingual kids and families, right? It doesn't count until they get to that school age, formal school age. So I think now pivoting to the issue of federal levers and the very challenging climate in the state of Arizona, my good colleague and superintendent of one of the districts here in the state will be speaking more to it, I'm sure, later. But, you know, this issue hits personally and professionally, right? I was born and raised in Arizona in a very small bilingual border town, right? Where all of us were bilingual or Spanish dominant, Mexican-American. My grandparents on both sides immigrated to Arizona from Mexico, where corporal punishment was still instituted, right, in schools. So my mom and all her siblings, right, tried their hardest not to speak Spanish in this small rural school in Southern Arizona, even as their parents did not speak English at home, right? So I'm now raising 2 bilingual kids a couple hours north from there, right? One of which is a student in the districts being sued by Tom Horn. And denying dual language education, especially after the research, right? We can have a multi-hour webinar on all of the research that shows that it's really the best approach, in particular for English learners, like not just for everybody, right? But in particular for kids who speak different languages at home. It's the most profound inequity, really, right? That we are still creating on purpose through policy, right? We're not, it's saying the quiet part out loud, right? Really boldly. So these kids have the most to gain from dual language education and the most to lose from not having access. And it appears that that's really the point of these harsh, inequitable, frankly, racist policies that are underway here. And so what can the feds do? You know, there are federal colleagues on the line already. We already heard from from Montserrat and all of the amazing work that the secretary over there is doing to lift up the benefits of bilingualism and the strengths that our kids bring to the classroom. I think one of the biggest piece that I would point to is the Office of Civil Rights, the U.S. Department of Education, protecting the rights of our kids from segregation, from subpar learning opportunities, from all of these practices that we know are not backed by research and best practice and that we've known for decades, right? Funding for new programs, more dual language programs, and ensuring that those new dual language programs, to Selina's point earlier, have a requirement for equitable enrollment, right? We need to be really thoughtful about the enrollment policies in these. Thinking about revising guidance on Castañeda to actually have a baseline of what good research and good sound education theory is. Aligning guidance with best practice. During the Obama administration, I led the drafting of the Obama-era federal HHS Ed policy statement on young emerging bilingual children. The guidance is not binding. It's not required. They're recommendations. But something on paper from the feds still moves people, right? Not enough, not sufficiently, but it makes a difference, right? Nearly 10 years later, I still hear from states and local communities that know of the statement, that have looked at the recommendations and implemented them over time. I think when ESSA is reauthorized, that's going to be another opportunity to really think through how we use those federal levers to advance equity for these students in particular. Data collection requirements, right? And publishing those data for transparency, right? And to better understand how these kids are being served, where they're being served well, where they're not being served well. I think the last thing I'll say is research, right? The federal government funds a lot of research, right? And I think it's time, for example, to stop funding research on, are all these English immersion approaches better, or is dual language better, right? And really get in the mindset of better understanding how to do bilingual education optimally, how to do it equitably, how to do it in a culturally sustaining way, and how to really invest in the structures we need at the state and local level to make sure that we are actually scaling the best practices and approaches. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chantel. Powerful recommendations and insight from the Children's Equity Project and yourself. Thank you so much. Next, we're going to turn to Marta Hernandez. Marta, you are a former school teacher and administrator, but currently serve as the executive director of Californians Together, a coalition of educators, civil rights advocates, parents and caregivers, community members, and advocacy organizations that champions the educational success of Californians' more than 1.1 million English learners. California is sometimes seen as a progressive panacea. So, do all English learners in California have access to a meaningful instruction? What types of legislative and policy advocacy is CalTOG currently involved in to move forward equitable access to multilingualism for English learners? And again, similar to Chantel, what should federal and state policymakers consider to trying to achieve these ambitious goals? Marta?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important panel. So even 50 years after Lau, and even though California has set forth a vision of multilingualism as a goal for all our students, and has put into place frameworks and policies for the education of English learners, challenges remain. And we continue to have too many English learners who do not receive comprehensive English language development. We still have a shortage of bilingual teachers, inadequate English-only assessments, a lack of linguistically, culturally relevant instructional materials, and teachers who are not prepared to teach English learners. So Californians Together continues to advocate and stand up for access to meaningful instruction. Lau versus Nichols has actually been a cornerstone piece of legislation during our tenure of 25 years of advocacy on behalf of English learners. We cited Lau versus Nichols as we struggled through an almost 2-decade-long era of English-only and one-size-fits-all approaches, particularly with Prop 227 and No Child Left Behind. We cite the ruling as we advocate for all profiles, typologies of English learners, including long-term English learners, newcomers, and duly identified students, as their needs differ. They are not a monolithic group. Lau versus Nichols was cited, and the rationale for the need to adopt a new English learner policy in 2017, the California English Learner Roadmap Policy that superseded Proposition 227. However, with the California EL Roadmap, as with Lau versus Nichols, there is a policy implementation gap. The English Learner Roadmap calls for full and meaningful access to 21st century education from early childhood through grade 12 that results in students attaining high levels of English proficiency, mastery of grade level standards, and opportunities to develop proficiency in multiple languages. This policy actualizes the intent of Lau versus Nichols. So we, as an advocacy organization, are focused on the implementation of this assets-based, comprehensive, and State Board of Education adopted English learner policy. There are many barriers to the implementation of the policy, such as widespread lack of awareness in a local control era, understanding and capacity among district staff, site administrators, and district level leadership related to building coherent and aligned local systems to give life to the roadmap. So in collaboration with GABE, the California Association for Bilingual Education, we are co-sponsoring 2 bills. One directs the California Department of Education to develop and lead a statewide plan for EL roadmap implementation to include the monitoring and reporting of the status of the EL roadmap implementation, among other items. The second bill would provide local district incentive grants for comprehensive English learner roadmap implementation to districts that have, high numbers and high percentages of English learners to engage in local planning and implementation efforts to actually enact the roadmap. And this would include the development of an English learner roadmap parent toolkit. We have also been working to ensure that the math framework met the needs of English learners. And so now that the new framework is adopted, we are now focused on ensuring that districts review and adopt math policies and practices to ensure equitable access to rigorous coursework for English learners and to ensure that staff are prepared and supported to provide integrated English language development to make rigorous math content accessible to them, a la Lau versus Nichols. Over the next 2 years, along with our partners, we will work to ensure that California's list of approved instructional materials for TK8 are not only aligned to the mathematics standards, but also to the English language development standards, and that they are culturally and linguistically appropriate and include strategies and supports for multilingual learners. And so in terms of the federal and state level, we need to improve our accountability system and make English learners visible by revising the current definition in terms of accountability of an English learner as 1 year of English learner and 4 years of reclassified fluent English proficient. This makes English learners invisible and minimizes the achievement of reclassified fluent English proficient students. And it lacks, it doesn't provide the urgency for districts to meet the needs of their English learners. And so all of these policy issues come under the umbrella of Lau versus Nichols and the provision of equal educational opportunities.
Thank you, Marta, very much. I know you and your organization, CalTalk, have consistently been strong advocates, and I would say one of the leaders, if not the leader in California. So thank you very much for your advocacy work. Our last panelist before we turn to our discussant is Trish Morita Mullaney. Trish, you are a professor, which is a little bit distinct from many of our panelists today at Purdue University. But you recently completed a book project that will be released soon about the lessons learned from Lau. So questions. In researching for this project, you interviewed many of the Chinese community members involved in the case after 50 years, which is an amazing sort of feat. So questions, what lessons learned did they share with you that you would like to share with all of our audience? And furthermore, how has the Chinese community advocacy been instrumental in catalyzing the movement for multilingual education? And what implications does this have moving forward? Trish?
Thank you, Oscar, and thanks for allowing me to be in the orbit of so many amazing language activists. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have some pictures. I promise they are brief and will help contextualize the narrative and the policy dive that I'm going to take with us today. I hope you can all see that. A thumbs up, Oscar. Am I good? All right. So this is part of my forthcoming book, which looks at the arc, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is one of the longest standing exclusionary immigration laws that foreclosed on one specific ethno-linguistic group from coming to the States. And therefore, because of this exclusion, there is a long-term construct of the Chinese being separate, being unequal, being unassimilable, and thereby perpetual foreigners. And although great progress has been made since Lau, since we see this 50 years later, there are still remnants of that persist into today. So I'm going to jump in and share with you a little bit about how I'm framing this particular inquiry and what I learned from the amazing activists on the ground in Chinatown, San Francisco, site and home of Kenny Lau and his mother. So I begin with my own narrative of my father, who's sitting down on the far right. And this is during the time that he was interned as a young child with his mother and father and 4 siblings during the Japanese American incarceration, imprisonment during World War II, because they were regarded as a suspect class. Mind you, everyone in this photo, with the exception of my grandfather, who is the large, tall guy sitting here, were basically, they were all US citizens. And so we see among Asian bodies that we have a history of subjugation. But we also have the simultaneous phenomenon of valorization. We talk of Asians as being a racial bourgeoisie, of being the model minority. And so when you have subjugation and valorization that happens either consecutively or concurrently, this is where the obscuring of this particular community becomes invisible. And so this inquiry dives into how language rights were made visible by the Chinese American community of Chinatown, San Francisco. So the first group of individuals that I share with you come from the Association of Chinese Teachers. All of them were part of forming this organization, which was an autonomous group of individuals who identified as Chinese American and worked in bilingual education. Some of them were Title VII fellows receiving their doctorates during the Bilingual Education Act's provisions for Title VII fellows. And these individuals worked tirelessly to advocate for bilingual education. However, at its onset, many of the Chinese American educators were ESL teachers in the junior high schools. And they were fearful of losing their jobs, as there had previously been a 3-person quota for Chinese to work within the school system. Therefore, they were concerned about losing their jobs. Furthermore, in loss of their jobs, they also regarded their Chinese as incomplete. And how could they do Chinese bilingual education when they were regarded as incomplete and imprecise speakers of their native and mother tongue? Through the Association of Chinese Teachers and curriculum writers such as Gordon Liu, who was the publisher of East-West, which ran a Chinese-English bilingual weekly newsletter in Chinatown, along with the Chinese for Affirmative Action and Dr. Ling Chi Wang, who worked in collaboration with Edward Steinham to identify the plaintiffs, the first set of plaintiffs and the second set of plaintiffs. And so when we see this array of individuals, and I'm just representing a small portion of these individuals, they worked in collaboration in order to galvanize bilingual education, eventually beginning a bilingual program. However, what it's important to know is that bilingual education in Cantonese and English preceded the adoption of Lau v. Nichols, the first Chinese-Cantonese bilingual program in the country, started in 1969 at Commodore Stockton Elementary, where many of these teachers would eventually teach. So you can see that all of these things happened in collaboration and in congruence with each other. And like Ed said, it wasn't just at the site of the schools. It happened in the community, it happened in the universities, it happened in advocacy organizations. So one of the important things that I want us to conclude with as I consider the different architects that I've just mentioned is we need to think about what I call the trifecta: language rights, affirmative action, and voting rights. And you can see that all of the Chinese American architects attended to language rights through these different methodologies. When we think about affirmative action, don't let me go, not last hire, first fire, Chinese Americans were able to keep their jobs because of Lau, and African American teachers were able to keep their jobs because of Brown. And so you can see that the Chinese American actors and architects of language rights also participated in affirmative action. And lastly, voting rights, where we see less representation among our Chinese American participants, but we do see representation among about half of them. As Ed shared earlier, voting rights is where we need to apply our emphasis. Voting rights falls under the 14th Amendment, and thereby our attention in the next 50 years really needs to focus on this. And there are great examples from the Chinese American community of Chinatown that offer credibility and advocacy for moving us forward in the next 50 years to realizing the trifecta of language rights, affirmative action, and voting rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trish. And thank you for the visuals of the community that was foundational and bringing this forward. And their advocacy, as you explained, continues until today. So thank you so much for highlighting that. I do want to remind our panelists that you're welcome to answer the questions. I see that 3 have been answered. There's 4 open questions. So when you're not speaking, feel free to peruse them and provide your insight to our participants who are listening. So now all the panelists have responded initially. I'm going to turn it over to our discussant, Kenji Hakuda. Kenji, you were a professor at Stanford University for many years and have worked extensively on issues regarding Lau at different levels, including but not limited to you as a researcher, also a META, multilingual education training and advocacy board member, an expert witness in court cases, among other things. What are your takeaways from the initial comments of the panelists? And again, do you have any thoughts about what the federal and state policymakers should consider doing to address the multitude of issues or some of the issues brought up by our panelists? Kenji?
Thank you. I think I've been here furiously taking notes, and just so many amazing ideas, both from history and current framing of issues. I think the only person that has a harder job than I do is Jean Garcia, who's going to be the discussant in the next panel, who will even have more to consider. But I just I'm just amazed by the richness. I mean, as an intellectual, I have the benefit of being philosophical about this and saying we're really working in an incredible area. It is just so you can look at the dark side and say, things are just so nasty and ugly. On the other hand, we're really seeing all of the complications of and the beauty of society working and trying to address human diversity and language diversity, and so it's the positive side is that it is exciting, and I just wanted to just share with you, probably not very coherently, but just some of the words that I took down, and maybe I'll offer a few comments around that, and starting with the framing of raising the bar as the current initiative, and the framing around the current administration. Words like collective action, assets, beyond the letter of the law, which is really how I think we all have benefited from Lau, because we've gone beyond what the letter of the law said, and have taken collective action in the various levels of government, levels of policy, levels of practice. In all of the different regions, Texas and California in particular have been raised, but there's lots of issues in much smaller states where lots of interesting things are playing out. So the richness of all this is a bit both something worth appreciating, but just is kind of adds to the cacophony here, from which we really should try to learn. The history of this, I just appreciate Selena mentioning Bambi and José Cárdenas, and the role that they played in I don't know how many trips they took to Washington D.C. To do their advocacy, and their legacy still continues to live in Texas, where bilingual education was not affected by the cancer that afflicted California, Arizona, and other states around bilingual education. Importance of early education. I think that is simply just a new frontier from the Lau perspective, because that really never got addressed, and yet I thought that Chantal's observation was absolutely spot on in how we need to really bring the science to bear on that work, and include we'll get to this later probably as well. In terms of the court of public opinion and the communication, there's nothing more cuter than young children, little kids, to win the hearts and minds of the public, and we really need to really think more about that. I thought a lot about sort of how much we frame this issue as a language and language rights and bilingual issue, and yet we can't forget that Lau was not just about access to the instruction through language. It was really about access to to all of educational content, and somewhere there we have to kind of come up with a delicate and effective way of communicating that this is really about the whole person, and not just about their language rights. Connections to ESSA and the data and the accountability, the research scaling issues, which I think Chantal also referred to. I think I started in this field in my own space in 1974 when assessment and student identification instruments were being developed. In those days, there were the bilingual syntax measure, the language assessment scales, IPT, a few of those that were coming out that were extremely primitive, and yet were important as a way of identifying the students that the Lau addressed. And those have morphed in the present day into the various measures that states have around English language proficiency, and have enveloped a much more content-based kind of language frameworks. Policy implementation gap, which Martha talked about so eloquently within the context of California. I know how researchers are often called on to address prong one of Castañeda, which is the theory. We really should be thinking about prong two, the implementation. How do we best understand implementation? What does implementation science look like for the kinds of programs that the theories have supported? And then how can we do a better job of evaluating programs on an ongoing basis and not just at the end of the year? Much more of a formative kind of evaluation process. Improving our accountability systems to better include reclassified students, so that we learn from the successful cases. I mean, reclassified English learners are doing fantastically. They're bilingual. They're doing as well, if not better, than mainstream students. And yet we don't take credit for that.
One more minute, Kenji.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I keep going because I just have written so many words here. Finally, I'll just wrap up by saying, the community and advocacy organizations and the role that they have played, and celebrating that as Trish is doing the work. I think that is just absolutely important. I'll just conclude by saying, Peter Roos, who worked with Meta along with Roger Rice, often talks about hearts and minds, that you really need to have arguments and a framing, not just about the minds and the theory and so forth, and the data and the practice and profession, but also win the hearts of the public. And I think we just, I think we've done a decent job in the last 50 years. We're really going to have to up our game, though, still, as we move into the future.
Thank you, Kenji, for that thoughtful analysis of the initial comments. So now we're going to do some follow-up questions with the panelists. And then, Kenji, you're going to have a tougher job to then try to give us some final thoughts at the very end. So I'll start with Ed. Speaking about the future, any thoughts regarding future opportunities in legal actions necessary to support English learners? Given the current SCOTUS and other federal courts composition, right, as we know, are other arenas such as state judiciaries where advocacy for appropriate and adequate education for English learners can be advanced? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, definitely there is that alternative of going to state court. There was a decision made by me at a very young age not to go to state court. I'm not sure it was wrong, but yes, you have other avenues. But when you use the word legal, I don't think the courts are where you want to go. I think we found out that these decisions are not self-executing. They're just words. And to the extent that people want to evade them, whether it's hearts and minds or just pure politics, to the extent that you talk legal, clearly it would be great to focus on state legislatures. And California had a wonderful law for 10 years, but it sunset, and we had a horrible governor named Umejian, and he kept vetoing it. And so again, we go back to the point that I started with, and I guess Tris ended with, that this is a political issue. And yes, you want to change hearts and minds, but it's the hearts and minds of the people in power, not necessarily the hearts and minds of others who may be voting.
Thank you, Ed. Selena, same question as Ed. Any future pathways from a legal judiciary perspective, given the federal court and the SCOTUS composition?
I tend to agree that it's a political issue, but there are certainly advocates seeking to vindicate the rights of emergent bilingual students at the state court level. So, for example, MALDEF was recently successful in challenging how the state of New Mexico served its emergent bilingual students. That's a state that has pretty robust state statutory and state constitutional protections that not every state has. And MALDEF and Roger Rice at Meta have a pending case right now against the state of Texas, seeking to require it to effectively monitor, implement, enforce, and supervise programs for emergent bilingual students at the middle school level and higher, because there's tens of thousands of those students right now across Texas who are not acquiring English proficiency as required by the EEOA, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act. I know that some advocates have also considered filing administrative complaints with the U.S. Department of Justice, the OCR with the U.S. Department of Education. Both have a record of recent enforcement of emergent bilingual students' rights under federal laws. So there is, as was mentioned, guidance, words on paper in place on this topic that advocates and families can rely on. So, for example, DOJ found last year that Clay County, Florida, violated the EOA, and DOJ and OCR, of course, issued joint guidance to school districts during the Obama administration. So there are advocates seeking to vindicate those rights through those channels as well.
Thank you, Selena. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move to Chantel for this next question, which, is a very contemporary issue that I think many school districts are having to deal with across the United States, which is, what is the policy at the federal and or state level for serving recent arrivals, right? We understand that, young children who are born in the United States go through their public schooling starting at age 3, 4, 5 years old. What are the responsibilities and policies to serve those that are recent arrival, especially those refugees from areas such as Central America that we're seeing quite a bit, South America, the Middle East, and others? And how can advocates make a difference to improve the policy and or the practice for these students that are many times at their most vulnerable state?
Thanks, Oscar. I think other folks on the call, especially the lawyers, can probably chime in on this better than I can. But we've done a lot of work at the Children's Equity Project, looking at issues related to unaccompanied children in particular, and that has been a pressing issue, I think, over the past 10, 15 years at different waves and different periods. The policies that we think a lot about in thinking about kind of holistic child development and wellness, including education access, is really thinking about their interactions, one, with the immigration system, right? Two, with the social service system. So the Department of Health and Human Services has responsibility to fund a network of placements across the country and settings and shelters across the country for these kids' health and then education systems. A few years ago, we looked at federal policy related to this particular group of children, more narrow group than the one you're referencing, but really looking at federal policy and then looking at all of the state licensing policies with respect to shelters and the rights for young children who are coming across the border or coming to this country without adults or who have been separated from the adults who they've come with. And so really looking at how all of those standards together and nested at the federal level, at the state level, align with child development. And that includes education rights and education access and access to an education in the community outside of many of these shelters. So we've done more work in that space, less work in the K-12 space, but I know others on the call have. And I think in terms of advocates, really similar to the stuff I mentioned a little bit earlier, right? Data is so important because we need to highlight where these inequities exist, where the needs are, and use that data to put pressure on the system. Really knowing and understanding the levers across federal and state agencies so that we know what we're asking for precisely, right? And who has agency and authority over what. Including language access, right, in this fight, and including this group of students in this conversation. I think the last thing I'd say, at the Children's Equity Project, we work on early care and education is kind of the heart. We do a lot on K-12. We're now in child welfare, immigration systems, at really looking at all of the systems that impact kids and families. And all of these have separate advocacy coalitions, right, that sometimes don't overlap at all, right? So like the child immigration group of advocates don't always, overlap with the certainly language equity and language justice and education equity and so forth. So really trying to build those bridges and connections and looking at these issues in an intersectional way, I think is another really important step for the advocacy community.
Thank you, Chantel. I just want to encourage participants, attendees, to keep putting in your questions, and also the panelists. Please continue to respond and answer the questions that you feel comfortable responding to. The next question is on another timely topic, I think, and this goes to you, Marta. One of the hot trends in education right now is this concept of the science of reading. But not much has been discussed about how the science of reading policy is impacting how schools are providing instruction, obviously reading instruction, for multilingual students in multiple languages. Can you address the impact of the science of reading on multilingual learners?
So this issue very much aligns with Lau versus Nichols. And so the science of reading is a body of knowledge, right, that must include research on what works for English learners in the area of literacy. And in many cases, it does not. In many instances, the science of reading has been misinterpreted and has become defined as a narrow approach that focuses primarily on foundational skills, leaving out so much that we know is essential for multilingual learners. Foundational skill instruction is essential, but not sufficient for emergent bilingual students. They also need to learn the meaning of the words that they are sounding out. So simply put, English learners must receive comprehensive instruction that includes all the elements of literacy, including meaning making, language and vocabulary development, effective expression, including writing, content and background knowledge, in addition to foundational skills. And we cannot forget the importance of oral language and ELD. ELD is a partner to literacy. So I think that despite good intentions, district and site leaders may mistakenly believe that the practices that they are implementing align with the science of reading. And here I'm talking about the science of reading for English learners, when in fact they do not. So some of these practices may include abandoning ELD, oral language and primary language support, as well as knowledge in the content areas such as history, science, the arts, limiting access to the full curriculum for the sake of a literacy block that focuses on foundational word reading skills and for extra periods of reading intervention. Also, something that is not something that we should aspire to, and that is superficially addressing the needs of English learners in professional development, and then providing little or no attention to ELD and the development of biliteracy for English learners. So a comprehensive approach to literacy for multilingual learners is a both and model that includes attention to social cultural issues. It is not a phonics versus meaning making or a reading versus writing or an English versus home language model. It is a yes model that recognizes the deep connections between language and literacy development and content knowledge. And so I wish I had more than 2 minutes because I could go on and on.
Thank you, Marta. I knew you do, and I knew you would have a great response for our audience members who are really interested in thinking about that and feel the impact in terms of how they need to approach their lesson planning and their work as educators and or policymakers. I'll move now back to Trish. As an academic and researcher, the question is really, you're on a panel with a lot of advocates, right? Yet as researchers, I don't know if we do enough of it or do it effectively enough. So the question is, should research and researchers be more connected to support advocacy and policy in support of multilingual learners? What needs to change for scholars and academics to engage in this type of work, as Chantel and others have mentioned, that are needed to provide some of the support mechanisms for advocacy?
Sure, thank you. So I think that one thing that is really critical is research praxis partnerships, RPP. And unfortunately, in larger districts, because there are concerns about litigation or being negatively portrayed in the press, it's very difficult for universities to gain access to public systems to conduct research, even very simple research that's small in scope. And so I think if schools can work really hard to reduce the bureaucracies involved, there would be more opportunity for researchers to work in collaboration. Oftentimes we see that researchers are now being people that work in the technology and the IT arena. They're hiring people with PhDs to run the numbers, to do quantitative studies, to look at the data in new and innovative ways. But generally speaking, what ends up happening is the school, with all of its good intentions, has an element of insularity. And I do not mean to be a Debbie Downer, but has an element of insularity, which then dictates what they want to look at when it may not be representative of what is actually going on in the ground with the community that's being directly impacted, namely emergent bilinguals. And so if universities, communities, and schools and other agencies, families can work in collaboration, that is ideal. And when we look at this small arc of how Lau was historically arbitrated in Chinatown in the lead up to Lau and the SCOTUS decision on Lau, they worked in solidarity and they worked beyond the school buildings alone. And so we have to really redefine our mental framework of what research looks like in schools. And we have to have a rubber band mentality where the borders are really stretched and more diffuse and aren't so siloed. And I think that would really help us identify like the trifecta that I talked about, because I think we all have similar aspirations and goals for policy and for how policy is experienced and enacted. But if we are all doing that in isolation, we're oftentimes doing duplicative work when we really should be doing more congruent work. So that would be my suggestion. As I learned from this story on Lau from the Chinatown community, it was incredible, the different players that were working on language rights, affirmative action, and voting rights. And I guess I would say too, is that I'll end with a quote. Jean Anyon says that equity cannot be solved at the site of schools alone, which means we have to involve the health industry. We have to involve housing. We have to look at how we plat our land and why do we have gated communities and rental communities, that we have to look more fundamentally at the ecosystem of our cities and communities.
Thank you, Trish. Yeah, it's a lot to consider, and also for those that are working in advocacy community organizations, thinking about, again, how can you reach out and build those partnerships that Trish was commenting on. Thank you so much. So we're gonna go sort of a fast fire round of 1 minute or less. What should be on the radar of either policymakers or anyone interested, policymakers or folks in the judiciary branch, in terms of what needs to be on their agenda to prioritize multilingualism and multilingual learners. So we'll actually go backwards. We'll start with Trish. Again, quickly, your one thought.
How can we advocate for multilingualism, that we center it as the norm, but I would say that we center it as the norm as based on minoritized youth and families, because I worry about the gentrification and the crowding out that English majority families are doing presently in dual language. So center multilingualism, but center multilingualism on the agents that already possess it as they begin their lives in schools.
Marta, your thoughts?
Well, I think that we need to make multilingualism the default program, especially for English learners. Just like we had English only for many years as a default program, it just needs to be the default program, because we know that our English learners do better at everything when they are enrolled in a dual language biliteracy program. And so that I think is something that we can all aspire to. And in California, I'm just thinking that, we want to make the EL roadmap policy, we want to actualize it and implement it. And so, we need to make sure that the California Department of Ed prioritizes this, sends messages that this is important, and then, of course, ensure that every English learner has the opportunity to become eligible for a state seal of biliteracy upon high school graduation, which means that we need to expand our dual language biliteracy programs in K-12.
You were able to squeeze a lot of things in 1 minute. Thank you, Marta. Chantel, you're next.
I think I'll focus on the two themes that I already focused on. And so high quality access, access to high quality dual language immersion, starting in infant, toddler, childcare, going through preschool, going through K-12, with a requirement for equitable enrollment. Again, I couldn't have said it better than Trish already said it, right? Build it around the kids who already speak these languages at home and for whom it's a core part of their identity.
Selena.
As we've seen with many important civil rights, nothing is free. And so we have to really remain vigilant to protect and advance the rights and educational opportunities of emergent bilingual students. And I think this is true regardless of who is in power and responsible for enforcing those rights. But I would say that in states with particularly regressive political climates, we have to get creative and courageous with how we build those coalitions necessary to protect those rights. And I think the students and families most impacted must be centered in those decision-making conversations. And so that's true in the classroom, that's true in research, that's true in state houses and in Congress. It is possible. We were really proud at IDRA to work through the Early Childhood English Learner Initiative and our State Racial Justice Coalition, TLEC, recently, with a multi-sector, diverse group of students, parents, educators, business, community leaders, to pass 4 bills in this most recent Texas legislative session that improves the lives of English language learners, emergent bilingual students. Así que siempre en comunidad y siempre adelante.
Thank you, Selena. And we'll end with the person partly responsible for this Lau v. Nichols, Mr. Ed Steinman.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about, to me, I'm focusing on issues that are not that relevant to a lot of the educators. I'm focusing on more things like community organizing. One thing that I think that we can have more of, if it's possible, and it's happening now in California, is movements to let non-citizen parents of school kids vote. And that to me is, if you're talking about laws, that to me is the direction I'd like to see go. The fact that they can vote doesn't mean they will. The fact that they can vote doesn't mean they'll vote the way we'd like. But again, to get more people involved, because again, all this stuff we're talking about are pieces of paper.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ed, and thank you very much. We're going to give Dr. Kenji Hakuda 1 or 2 minutes to give his final thoughts.
I will frame my comments. The perspective is really that I was taking as everyone talked was what will the next generation of people like us look like, and how do we create that? So how do we frame the next generation of teacher educators, of people who develop child development programs, the legal profession, policy analysts, system leaders, researchers. And I think if you think what the kinds of the sort of future that we envision here, addressing these issues in the ways that we've talked about, collaboratively, collectively, and so forth, I think it's a significant problem where the systems that we have currently for training these people are going to have to change. They're going to have to change their incentives. They're going to have to change the ways in which they're more inclusive. And I think that the sort of what are the system incentives that we need to really identify and try to move in order to create the future leaders of all of the kinds of expertise that we've seen represented on this panel.
Thank you so much, Kenji. So I would like to just a virtual round of applause for our first panel. Please tweet, communicate on social media that panel number 2 is about to start. So those of you who are having dinner, especially on the East Coast, hopefully you can rejoin us. And I just want to thank all of panel number 1 for your great expertise. And I would like to ask panel number 2 to now join the screen, if you could. And again, those panelists that finished participating, please answer those questions that are in the Q&A, and make sure that we continue to engage with this broader community. So now we have panel number 2, which again is a great distinguished panel of educators, academics, and leaders. And this panel is going to focus a lot on how do we move from policy to practice. And this is where hopefully a lot of those that are participating and listening to this webinar, many of whom are teachers, hopefully will resonate with some of the, and leaders will resonate with some of the responses. So again, I'm going to ask a question to each panelist, have 5 minutes to respond. And then after that, we'll allow the discussant to give some feedback and some thoughts and responses to those. And then we'll do some follow-up questions like we did with panel number 1. So I'll start panel number 2 with Carlin Aguilera Fort. Carlin, I don't know if you're...
He's unable to activate the video camera, but he is present and we can hear his remarks.
Yeah.
Okay,
I will
very
respond.
good.
It says that for some reason I can join because it has stopped. So I'll okay.
So Carlin, let me ask so currently you have been a superintendent in the Oxnard School District and the El Rancho Unified School District, and currently serve as the Associate Superintendent of Educational Service in San Francisco Unified School District, right? The original Lau district. Can you tell us about the history of implementation of the consent decree in San Francisco Unified under Lau? And now that the San Francisco Unified School District is no longer under a court mandate, what are the next steps for San Francisco Unified School District to move from access to meaningful instruction to equitable access to multilingualism? Carlene.
Thank you. And again, thank you for inviting me to join this great panel. So let's start immediately after the Lau consent decree was approved by the court. San Francisco Unified School District was mandated to develop a plan to implement the consent decree. So the Board of Education at that moment approved and adopted the first master plan for K-12 bilingual, bicultural education in response to the consent decree. At that moment, the idea was to provide access and for every, at that moment, English learner in the district of San Francisco Unified School District. That plan since the 70s until late 90s and then 2008 was revised in few iterations. The most meaningful revisions happened in 2008 and then 2015. In 2008, with the support of the Lau plaintiff, San Francisco Unified School District submitted to the court the modified, what we call at that moment, modified Lau plan. And that plan outlined at that moment all the specific set of programs, services, support for our multilingual learners. It included a specific explanation about the kind of assessments, a specific explanation about the program, the supports, and the professional development. In 2008, there was a whole revamping of the services for our multilingual learners in San Francisco Unified School District. That plan was carried until 2015, and that year, again, with the support of the Lau plaintiff, we adjusted and modified the plan. I think it's important to name that in 2008 and 2009, when the big revision happened, it included participation and feedback from many, many organizations, including Chinese for Affirmative Action and the Latin American Teachers Association to support this new development of the Lau plan. Once the Lau plan was developed, the district realized that it's not just to have it on paper. We need to make sure that the plan is implemented, that we monitor, that we assess. And at that moment, San Francisco Unified School District decided to invite Ms. Christina Wong to be part of the team of San Francisco Unified. And what was unique about Ms. Christina Wong at that moment is that she was working with Chinese for Affirmative Action, and she understood what were the needs expressed by the community at that moment. And so she was hired as the special assistant to the superintendent. And her first charge was to make sure that we implement and then monitor the, at this moment, again, still we call it the Lau plan. Until 2015, we continue implementing. And after 45 years, in 2019, through the work of Christina Wong with our staff, our teachers, and due to the robust work with our multilingual department, San Francisco exited from the consent decree. That required, again, because the mandate is still for us, a moral responsibility, besides that California has a very clear policy about implementing programs that support our multilingual learners. So then San Francisco, since 2009 until most recently, 2023, started working on the development of what was approved as the multilingual learners roadmap, using the cornerstone policy of California called the English Learner Roadmap. And now, as we have designed that, That plan also follows some of the features that we follow with the previous plan. So that included consultation with Asian American Administrators Association, Chinese for affirmative actions, advisory committees in special education, the district, the DLAC, what we call it here, the District English Learner Advisory Committee, and the Latin American Teachers Association, and many other organizations that work with our English learners. And that plan was developed with the staff, with these organizations. And now the main goal and the vision with this plan is to make sure that all of our multilingual learners attain high levels of English proficiency, mastery of grade level standards, and clear, defined opportunities to develop proficiency in multiple languages. As you can see, it's an asset-based model and doesn't talk about deficiencies and doesn't talk about English proficiency as the remedy. It is actually our responsibility to make sure that our multilingual learners acquire English at high levels of proficiency while also learning and being proficient in different languages. So that's where we have been. And the key piece from this framework of services for our students, it is that it outlines all the theory, but it also outlines the practices, some of those which we have learned under consent decree. It follows the legal requirements, which is the compliance piece. But from San Francisco Unified School District perspective, we want to make sure that our students achieve at high levels. And again, all the different pieces of compliance connected to California Department of Education and federal mandates are part of it, but our main goal is to ensure that our students are proficient and they are meeting and exceeding the standards so that they can be successful. And so right now, we are literally planning that professional development that will allow our teachers to understand the multilingual learner roadmap, how it will be implemented, what are the strategies, how our English language development will be disseminated, will be explicitly supported throughout all of our entire set of schools. And that includes all the diverse set of language programs that we have, because San Francisco has those programs.
Thank you, Carlene. And interesting in terms of hearing from the Lau plaintiff lawyer, hearing from Trish, now hearing a representative of the San Francisco Unified School District, Associate Superintendents of San Francisco. Thank you very much, Carlene. We're going to transition to another set of context. And next is going to be Michael Robert. Michael, unfortunately, you have witnessed firsthand anti-bilingual initiatives in both California, when you were a teacher and an administrator, and in Arizona, when you moved to Arizona. You currently serve as the superintendent of the Osborne School District in Arizona. Contrasting to sort of the lawsuit against San Francisco Unified School District 50 years ago, by not providing meaningful instruction to students, the irony in Arizona, and you will explain this better than I, is recently the Arizona Superintendent of Education, Tom Horn, has come after several districts, including, I believe, yours, who actually are offering the high-quality dual language education to multilingual learners via a lawsuit of the Arizona Governor and Attorney General. How have you been able to navigate the politics of language policy and policy implementation to ensure opportunities for multilingual learners to be full participants in high-quality bilingual programs, especially in low-income, non-native English-speaking communities? Michael.
Thank you, Oscar, for the invitation. It's exciting to be in this webinar celebration of Lau and the goals of achieving multilingualism. However, unfortunately, as you mentioned, in Arizona, we're still in the struggle of access. Navigating has really been my career as an administrator here in the state of Arizona. During the late 90s, early 2000s, Ron Unz had his initiatives going to bring English-only laws to different states in the United States, California, then Arizona, attempts in Colorado, although failed, and in Massachusetts. And all of those laws have been removed in states with the exception of Arizona. So we sit as the lone exception to English-only laws still on the books here in Arizona. My journey, as you mentioned, started in 1994 in Southern California as a dual language and transitional bilingual education teacher. I would manage to, in recognizing that Prop 227 was coming, I managed to move to Arizona, which only gave me a couple of years before Prop 203 raised its head here in Arizona. At the same time that Prop 203 was being prepared and passing, my district, although I wasn't there at the time, the Osborne School District was forming a dual language program as an alternative to transitional bilingual ed programs with enrichment, but also intent of language and cultural preservation for Spanish language speakers. In the early years of Prop 203, there was little enforcement, but it ramped up with expectations for enforcement through program audits. There was a separation of ELLs with a 4-hour English block, lack of access to core content, removal of bilingual or Spanish language text from shelves. Teachers with accents weren't to be teaching in those structured English immersion classrooms. And the removal, of course, of English learners from dual language programs. So when I moved to Osborne in 2007 as principal of Encanto Elementary School, a preschool through third grade school, began that navigation of language policy as a principal. And we started off by examining the law as it was originally written and interpretations or provisions that were possible. So it wasn't intended to be for more than 1 year. It was a transition period, supposedly. Students had to have good English skills as measured by oral evaluation, had to be at grade level academically, measured being approximately at or above grade level. So our navigation of this law back in 2007, 2008 was we looked at the English learner assessment test as students came in, and kindergartners had to be proficient in order to be in the dual language programs. But all of our other English learners, we looked, number one, if they were able to reclassify, but we looked for oral proficiency. That's what Prop 203 said initially, looking for good English language skills as measured by oral evaluation. We also looked to see if students were at or approximately above grade level. And if they were, we kept our English learners in our dual language programs. We had EL program audits without any corrective action. And so we maintained keeping dual language learners as long as they were, language learners, English learners, in our dual language programs as long as they were orally proficient and making good academic progress. So we weren't able to navigate in order to get all English learners, but we did far better than a lot of programs which were starting to close. We saw lots of dual language programs closing those programs. And those that remained were significantly gentrified, which is a huge problem with dual language programs nowadays. Took a lot of work with parents. We had to explain how their child qualified, got waivers for all families, but this was also at the same time as Senate Bill 1070, which was the very anti-immigration show me your papers law that was going on. So racial profiling was legal in the state of Arizona at the same time that these restrictive language policies were happening. We, of course, saw a decrease in enrollment, but we also saw strong academic performance within our dual language programs. In fact, our dual language programs outperformed our non-dual programs, almost as you would anticipate. So since 2019, there were some changes where we no longer had to have waivers. The 50-50 program was an option as a dual language, as an English language model. 1 minute? All right, thank you. And we've been having more visits from other school districts to see what we're doing here in Osborne. But then, of course, this lawsuit came about, which is saying we're being sued because we're allowing English learners into our dual language program, which is still state approved by the State Board of Education. And that's kind of why we're able to continue, even though this lawsuit happens. By advancing the continuation of separation and limiting access in education on the basis of language acquisition, our state superintendent is requiring superintendents to sign affidavits that critical race theory is not being taught, yet propagating practices that will assure that critical race theory continues as a legal study. It's quite an amazing state to be in, but the strong work continues to be done.
Thank you, Michael. I worked and lived in Arizona for those years, so I completely understand the challenges, and thank goodness we have superintendents like yourself and other great leaders across the state to sort of fight back against some of these policies. Next is our third superintendent of this panel, which we're really excited about having three superintendents. Pedro Martinez, you are, or you were superintendent in the San Antonio Independent School District, and you're currently the CEO at Chicago Public Schools and the chair of Chiefs for Change. A lot of big districts, a lot of interesting organizations. In the context of Lau, can you speak of the dynamics of trying to implement change and equity-minded reforms for multilingual learners? How were some of your successes achieved, and especially given the insight of California and now Arizona? What are the challenges and opportunities moving forward for large urban school districts across the United States?
Well, thank you, Oscar. Thank you for having me. And it's been a pleasure just listening to the history. So I'll start a little bit in San Antonio. When I was in San Antonio, I started as superintendent in 2015, a district with about a 97% poverty rate and only two dual language programs, even though a large percent of their students were more multilingual students. Over almost a 7-year period that I was there, we went from 2 schools having dual language programs to over 60 out of 100. And now, by policy, the pathway now for multilingual students is a dual language program. And one of the reasons we're able to show that is because those students were outperforming not only the students in our district, but also across the state. And we were able, actually working with organizations like IDRA, to actually secure more funding even for dual language programs. And that really was a lot of change management, really developing capacity with teachers, having a lot of conversations, partnering with researchers to talk to parents. We even took parents to districts in the Valley that had multilingual programs for decades to show them how students were graduating even more successful than monolingual students. In Chicago, a larger district, we have one of the largest multilingual programs in the country with almost over 80,000 students. Spanish being the primary language, we have multiple languages. And here, we really are embracing, really grounding ourselves not only on good Tier 1 instruction, but also a culturally responsive curriculum, many supports for our students. And what our researchers have shown here, and we partner with amazing institutions, including the University of Chicago, who have shown in research that when our students, as they finish their transitional bilingual programs, they begin to outperform their peers. And our dual language students also continue to do the same. And this is an area for us of opportunity where we see a significant opportunity to grow our dual language programs and really build on the infrastructure, strong infrastructure we have of our transitional bilingual programs. And one of the things that I'm very excited is our district last year had a record graduation rate, but more importantly, over a 25% increase in students with the seal by literacy. And so for us, it really is what it takes is constantly having the conversation of the importance of, and really the value of culture, the value of language. In San Antonio, we integrated that with the arts, and it was just wonderful to see that play out, whether it's our mariachi programs or folklorico programs. In Chicago, we're still behind on that area in the arts, but again, I see another opportunity to grow that. Some of our challenges that I see right now, specifically here in Chicago, is we're a city that is receiving a significant number of migrant students. The majority of them, we're getting them in pre-K to kinder and first grade, which for me makes me very optimistic about the long term because that's where we have the most success with our multilingual students. But I am also getting students in middle school and high school. It is wonderful to go into those classrooms and I see, we leverage our ESL and bilingual certified teachers and we continue to expand that group. But what I love is how the students are grouped, how the students can find community within each other, whether they're coming from, and I have students coming, by the way, not only from Central America and South America, but from Africa, from the Middle East, from Ukraine. And so again, I'm seeing some interesting strategies in our schools as they're working with that, but it still is a challenge because we're not receiving any additional funding. And so I'll end with this. I think as we think about, we have had in this country such a negative attitude towards our multilingual students, always seeing our students as if they were less. And I say that as me, myself, coming from Mexico when I was turning 6, and how I felt and how I was treated, and by the way, in the district that I'm leading today. And so, when I think back, this is the same kid now is heading the district, but when I was 6 years old, I felt less then. And so that is something that always stays with me. And that's what I think we need to change is the attitudes. And of course, it doesn't help when the politics become so ugly and our students become targets, which I continue to worry about. But I'll leave it this optimistic note. I see great things happening, not only in my former district of San Antonio, but also here in Chicago. And I see an opportunity to elevate our culture, elevate language, and really promote not only with our multilingual students, but other students that really, frankly, also want to learn a second language.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pedro. I got to know Pedro when I was also in San Antonio. So thank you, Pedro, for your comments and your insights about leading change in these politically trying times. We'll shift our attention to one of the issues that has been brought up on several occasions in panel number 1 and also panel number 2. So we'll shift to Cristina Alfaro. Cristina, you have been involved with bilingual teacher education as a professor for many years and currently serve as the Associate Vice President of International Affairs at San Diego State University. With your extensive background in teacher education and international education, what key programs initiatives have you found effective in recruiting and preparing high-quality multilingual or bilingual teachers? How do we fill the gap, the shortage of multilingual teachers across the country? Cristina?
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Oscar. As promising, my 30 plus years in bilingual teacher preparation, I've learned a lot of lessons. And first and foremost, what I always think about is that as promising as the benefits of dual language bilingual education are, the shortage of and the failure to adequately recruit, support, and prepare bilingual teachers threatens the effective and equitable implementation of dual language programs. Bilingual teacher education programs in the U.S. have had to navigate around and through anti-immigrant sociopolitical ideologies and survive a lot of the incessant political attacks. Notably, and everybody's already spoken about this, is Proposition 227, because that was a big hit for teacher preparation programs. Teachers were not coming. I remember in our department, I was department chair, and they would say, why should we want a bilingual credential? It's an English only, education. So we really had to look at how do we begin to create this critical consciousness for teachers that really believe and really care about the communities that they serve. So what we started to look at was, just intensifying a lot of the conversations among bilingual teacher educators. Many of you are here today across the nation. And a lot of it was revolving around the challenges and identifying and naming and confronting a lot of unyielding issues that would arise in preparing teachers and also the professional development for teachers that were already out there, because after 20 years of 227, many of our bilingual teachers went back to English-only programs. And some of them didn't want to come back because they realized, you know what, it's so much easier to teach in a monolingual program. So just a lot of incentives that we had to work to get people back. So one of the key things that I've learned, and along with my colleagues, is that we had to find a very critical way and take a very critical step in recruiting teachers again. And we had to meet teachers where they are. We have to support them, we have to guide them, we have to nurture them, and we have to mentor them. And in doing this, what we have found is, I have found in so many years of recruiting teachers, is that many of our teachers that are heritage speakers or students candidates come with what we call language shame, because they want to be bilingual teachers, but they've been in English only education, so they kind of disqualified themselves and say, like, you know what, my Spanish sucks, or I really am not prepared to do this, or whatever. So one of the key lessons that we learned in this process was that we needed to develop a course within our teacher preparation program that really strategically elevates the candidate's competence in the language, and also to create courses, methods courses that would help them to really elevate their language, and also bilingually. At San Diego State University, we have done this in Spanish. So that's really critical. And also because students would say, okay, if you're going to help me with this development, okay, maybe I can do this. Another key area that I think is critically important in preparing teachers, especially right now with the gentrification that we've already talked about, you know, just the importance of developing this ideological clarity and critical consciousness, is that bilingual teachers need to be prepared to interrogate their ideological stance. They really need to understand the history and the struggles that we have engaged to be here today. And you have all spoken to what these political, ideological, sociopolitical struggles have been. And to fulfill this promise, the intent of bilingual education, it is imperative that we really focus on developing critically conscious teachers. I see so many young teachers that are there and have no idea of what we had to do to get where we are. They have no idea of the struggles, the long struggles, the work that many of you have done to get there. So the challenge really is for educators to cut, I guess, the ideological yoke of colonialism and be engaging bilingual pre-service teachers in the process of really thinking about their work and looking at what's happening right now with the gentrification of dual language bilingual education. So just real quickly, I mean, let's think about this. Look at all of these socially constructed labels that we have given our students, okay? And real quickly, I'm going to share just one slide. But I think of this quite often. Ed mentioned, you know, what do we call them? The Lau kids, the NEP kids, the LEP kids, the FEB kids, the ELs, the long-term English learners, the ever English learners, the emergent bilinguals, dual language learners for preschool, bilingual learners. And of course, every time we've been going from more of a deficit to a more asset-based language. And of course, I think one of the ones that many of us are using right now is multilingual learners. But in 2019, Lilia Bartolome, a colleague of mine, and I said, what if we just call them linguistic geniuses? Because that's what they are. So we wrote an article about that I would like to really share with you. Let me see. Did I turn it off? Did I turn off my share?
Yes. But Cristina, okay, I think you're out of time, but you will have time to respond to a follow-up question.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next is Magali Lavandes. And Magali, you have been a teacher and school leader and past president of CABE, and currently serve as a professor and executive director of the Center for Equity for English Learners, CEO, Can you share some of the key initiatives or policies you have championed to support bilingual education and equity for English learners? Your research focuses on the intersection of the impact of policies and practices for culturally and linguistically diverse students. In your view, how can educators and school leaders address these issues to create more equitable learning environments for multilingual learners?
Well, thank you, Oscar. I have the dubious distinction of being the last panelist before the end, so I will try to consolidate and also build upon so many of the great comments that have been shared this evening from both panel 1 and my fellow panelists on panel 2. Well, one of the things that had been said that I think bears repeating is this idea of, in order to create equitable learning environments, we need to break through some of the boundaries that we have created, the silos that sometimes we create and perpetuate ourselves. These are ideological, educational, political, environmental, and also think about the lens of equity through which Lau allows us to view. We need to be willing to engage ourselves with organizations, across organizations, to be uncomfortable, to be in those spaces and persist in them. Trish mentioned the idea of research practice partnerships, and my colleagues and I have talked about adding a P, research practice policy partnerships. These are not researcher driven. They are driven by districts, by leaders, administrators there who seek to identify goals and inquiry that's locally relevant. We also know and have learned from much of the research that I've done is that we need clarity on what equity means. In some of the work that I've done with many collaborators, including with PACE at Stanford, we've done interviews with many leaders, and we found a bit of a confusion. As many as 25% of the leaders we've interviewed in several studies are not sure what equity means. So defining equity, and it's been said already, defining equity to build those bridges. Teachers can't do it alone. Administrators can't do it alone. Families and communities need to be included in this. One of the things that I wanted to uplift in this idea of implementing equity is one of the vehicles that has not been mentioned, and that is in school finance policy reform. We know that because of Title III, almost 48 states have at least some level of differentiated funding for English learners. And we know there's great diversity of English learners, and we need to break down some of those nomenclatures as well. But in California, in 2013, we adopted the local control funding formula, which allowed districts to create their own accountability system through a document called the Local Control Accountability Plan. Formed on 3 grounding principles: equity, performance, and continuous improvement. And we published through Californians Together 4 reports that in districts with high numbers and high needs of English learners, we didn't find equity either defined well or differentiated in terms of the supports, the resources, the actions. And one of them was professional development. So you could have blanket professional development, and then you relegate professional development for English learners. Either it's missing, or it's not named at all, or it's a minor lack of differentiation. We also want to be able to ensure that through this state system, that through LCFF, we have another opportunity to be able to distinguish what English learners need. We concluded that the quest for equity is still elusive. We cannot forget that. And we also know that we continue to need to push forward together, and we have a new opportunity through the new local control funding formula LCAP tool in 2024-2027. And the partnership that we've had for many, many years with Californians Together allows us to really seek that clarity, partner with advocacy agencies to be able to use research that is actionable and to provide information that's part of this movement. One of the continuing legacies of Lau is that it has been a movement that we can't forget, and we have to be ready for counter movements against equity, against educational justice, against things that have been named already before. And we have a looming challenge with this next presidential election. So with the school finance formula, that's an area of work that we need to do. And our center has also worked very hard to do research that is actionable, that is faster to be produced, that is interpretable easy, that it's not only for researchers, it's a different incentive structure that we know is part of the barriers that we have, the boundaries that we create for ourselves in higher education. Do I have more time?
Thank you, Magali. I think that's perfect. We've heard from 3 superintendents. We've heard from Cristina. We've heard from Magali. Now to sort of give us a little bit of synthesis in terms of what has been talked about is the discussant, Jean Garcia. Jean, you have been a professor, an administrator for many years at Arizona State University and UC Berkeley, among other institutions. You have also been a school board member and a U.S. Department of Education director of Title VII back in the day, Title III now under the Clinton administration. What is your response to, you can go back to panel even number 1, and but focused on panel number 2 as well.
Bueno, muchas gracias y muy buenas noches. Un placer estar con todos ustedes. I know that all of you are attending this, and I have to admit, Kenji is right. My challenge is exponentially greater than his on panel 1. I'm trying to address all the wonderful things that have been said historically and empirically and from a practice side that I think are important to take into consideration. My lenses are 3, if you don't mind, 3 personas, lenses. I come to this arena as a researcher. So when I listen to my panelists, I listen very carefully that they are actually following the science, whether it's in San Francisco, whether it's in here in Osborne or in Chicago. What I hear is individuals who are taking a lead in knowing what they need to do based on what we know, the knowledge base, and implementing that. And I think that is critically important. Lau might have been the spark plug, but these individuals are taking that information and extending it. Someone already used the term, our colleague, beyond the law. I would argue they're doing much more than that. They're expanding and navigating their own circumstances, their own context. In Arizona, very different than Illinois, very different than San Francisco. And yet each are able to navigate what it is that we must do to what it is allow or other policies dictate that we should do. So we need to essentially understand that sort of compromise that's being addressed by these practitioners. Of course, we have to have the workforce. Christina, we cannot, as you indicate, do what is being done in these 3 school districts without the individuals to implement it. And the key is, in fact, those people who are in classrooms. They're not the only ones. They're not the only ones. But it seems that that individual is going to continue to make a difference as they always have been. I am proud to say my wife and my daughter are both teachers, and they do more than I ever could in terms of making an impact on the children that they serve and the families and communities that they serve. Also, I hear all of you saying we need to work with our communities, plural, extended. Magali, your work with extensive communities mirrors or connects the research with, in fact, what's needed in those communities. As you all know, each community is different. Each population is different. Kenji has already made it clear. We're very diverse in our ways to think about a population of children and families that come to school essentially in ways dealing with something that is not primarily in their own culture and their own language. I love the intersection all of you brought with those communities and acknowledging, in Pedro's way, think about, is not only the language, it's the culture. You cannot separate those two. Unfortunately, policy has not addressed that issue at all. As it has not addressed our youngest, it has also just said, let's teach them language. You cannot separate children and family from their language and their culture. So I would say what we are learning basically is that Lau was a spark plug. We have better research, we have better practice, but we do not yet have equitable outcomes or equitable access for the children and families that we so much care about. Our challenges are far ahead of us. We have many things that we have to address. Panelists have addressed very, very specific ones, everything from comprehensive voting activities to in knowledge base, so our families and our communities understand what it is that their possibilities exist in essentially in the educational system. I leave you with the notion that we are not there yet, but Lau helped us take one step towards where we need to be.
Thank you, Gene. Brilliantly synthesized, and I think captures the spirit and the insights of all of our outstanding panelists. So next, we don't have too much time left before the webinar ends. So if you can make your next responses to these follow-up questions really as brief as you can, it would be greatly appreciated to make sure all of those listeners are really engaged and can get on to their other business that they have planned for today. And I'm gonna sort of really try to hone in on the folks that we haven't talked about as much, and that is sort of the teachers and the curriculum and the pedagogy that they have to navigate. So I would like actually each one of you to think about what advice would you give to that novice teacher that's coming into a setting. It could be a bilingual setting, it could be an ESL setting, it could be an ELD setting, or another type of secondary with newcomer students. Think about what advice would you give to that novice teacher to make sure that their instruction and their pedagogy is as meaningful to the students and as dignified to the students that they're teaching. If you can quickly give each of you a response to that question, directing and talking directly to many of the folks who are listening today that are educators. We'll start again. We'll go backwards with this response. So we'll start with Magali.
Well, one piece of advice that I've always given my beginning bilingual teachers is make sure that you equally interview the school site, the administrator, to find out what kind of support and resources they have for beginning bilingual teachers. And in general, it applies to beginning teachers of English learners as well. Make sure that you know that you're working into a school culture that will support your success and retention in the profession.
Thank you, Magali. Cristina.
Yes, I would say that it's really important for teachers, especially beginning teachers, to really embrace an objective and sociolinguistic understanding of the existing knowledge that their students come with and build on that. And once again, I go back to viewing them as linguistic geniuses and making sure that they also build on their cultural capital. Interesting that you say this because we just published a book, and I think Esther DeJohn is on the call, and Juan Freire, where we developed a handbook of the dual language bilingual education, which has a lot of coverage of pedagogy, policies, theoretical assessment, and so on and so forth. And in fact, many of you here are authors in that book. So that's one of the things that we were able to do collectively to help really prepare and critically prepare teachers for the field. Gracias.
Thank you, Cristina. Pedro, what's your advice to those teachers across the country, those teachers in Chicago, those teachers in San Antonio where you've been before?
So number one, the advice I always give our teachers is know you're not alone. So there are structures within your school that we've invested. There's structures within our district. So always never be afraid to ask for help and really get to know your children, really get to know who they are. And one of the things that I have found is when our students, when our teachers, and we give them that time, especially at the beginning of the school year, just to really get to know before they go heavily into academics. But there are supports across our schools. There are supports across the district. So please, I always say, please make sure you ask for help. Your success is going to be our success.
Well stated, Pedro. Michael, again, different context. What do you tell your teachers, especially those across the state of Arizona, in these political times that you and we are living in?
Yeah, two sets of teachers to talk to, K-12 teachers and university teachers. To the K-12 teachers, I would say, if you're watching this webinar, you clearly have defined values. Make sure that you understand the values of the school districts that you're going to work for. We've managed to do this difficult work for 25 years in providing access to our students. And through lawsuits, through all this complex navigation, try and align yourself with districts, hopefully like Osborne, that are wanting to do this work and that you're wanting to and willing to do the work. And to the university professors, I like Cristina said, those methods courses are critically important. 30 years ago, when I was taking my master's in certification coursework in the Cal State system, I was fortunate to take all my methods courses in Spanish. And it was a fundamental, I'm not a primary Spanish speaker, so it was fundamental for me to build that academic language so that I was prepared for going in and speaking and working with my students and parents.
Thank you. Absolutely important to speak to sort of the teacher educators as well as the P12 educators as well. Thank you, Michael, for making sure that there is that interrelationship between the two. And we'll end the conversation with, before we get back to Gene and his final thoughts about teaching and learning, Carlene, what are you telling your teachers at San Francisco? So now that there's no consent decree, they could do whatever they want. I know that's not the case. You've already explained the vision, but what explicitly do you tell those teachers in San Francisco now that there isn't that consent decree? What opportunities are there? What challenges are there? What motivation is there for them to continue to do the good work?
So number one, the responsibility is the same. We are here to make sure that our students are learning and they are successful, and especially those students who are not yet mastering English as a second language. So that is our moral and professional responsibility besides the law. And I will go back to my classroom when I was first hired from Venezuela in San Francisco Unified School District. Herminda Garcia was a teacher at that moment that was a research teacher that came to my classroom. And I will tell you one lesson that I learned, and one of the panelists mentioned this. She made sure that I knew that each one of my students had a set of strengths and linguistic assets. And using exactly what they come in that kind of linguistic assets, I was able to get to know them better. The second piece, besides getting to know my students, getting to know their parents and their families, because that connection, as parents know that I knew them and that I really care about them, families were also inclined to just make sure that the kids were coming to school. The third piece will be go and ask for help to your colleagues that have more experience. Watch videos, watch the lessons, look at for resources. There are organizations in every single state, as far as I know, most of the states, that provide resources for teachers of multilingual learners. CADE, NADE, TADE. So go to those organizations because they do provide support for you. And for my colleagues in San Francisco, we still have that high commitment and we haven't reached the levels that we need to reach, because some of our multilingual learners are still performing at levels that we do not want them and that are not going to ensure their success. So we need to make sure that we follow the plan. Please reach out for the resources. Our multilingual department is setting up the professional development that will support you, and just again, get to know the kids and know that we are here to support you.
Thank you, Carlene. And those of you who don't know out in the audience, Herminda Garcia, as this fabulous teacher that Carlene described, also happens to be Gene's better half, I believe.
That's correct.
Gene,
That's correct.
Your
Yes.
final thoughts You've written books about teaching and learning for
Yeah.
English learners and multilingual learners. What is your advice for teachers and or teacher educators?
Yes, I'm sorry if you had to read any of the things that I've ever written, but some of you may have had to. Se comienza con respeto. You begin the whole process of social interaction in an educational setting with respect. Respect that child, respect that family, respect that community. It starts there. If you disrespect those individuals, then you have no way you're going to be able to assist and promote teaching and learning in any classroom. I say this as a school board member because I think I had to approach my colleagues in the school board with that notion. We need to respect. Oh, they're immigrants. They don't speak English. They're poor. Con respeto. Con respeto. Se comienza con respeto. When I was in Washington, believe it or not, maybe lots of issues that relate to disrespecting the population that we were supposed to be serving. And so I do think that the best advice we have is to respect those individuals that you are meant to serve. Best I could do at the moment.
Thank you, Gene. I would like again to give a virtual round of applause to this very talented and distinguished panel. Thank you so much for your time. I would like to invite the dean to come back on if she's able to give some closing remarks to this panel. Dean Ganley.
I'm here. Let's see. Somehow, I think I'm having trouble getting back online.
Let me see. I think I can help.
Okay.
And I'll ask
am.
panel number 2 to be off, cameras off. Thank you.
You know, as I listen to our panelists, I have to say that I'm overwhelmed by the commitment, the knowledge, the sense of history, the sense of importance, and the sense of justice that is coming through. I think for me, one of the resounding thesis that comes out of it is that if there's a will, there's a way. That we know we can make this change. We just need to continue to work towards language justice and language equity and stay the path. We will get, you know, it's attainable. It's something that we need to keep doing. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but progress is made. And as I think, Oscar, you said, it's more needed now than ever, more relevant. So I just really appreciate the panelists, but also everybody in the audience for coming here and connecting over this important topic.
Thank you, Dean. And I'll give some final thoughts and remarks as well. Again, I just want to thank all of our panelists and also the Assistant Deputy Director, Montserrat Garibay, for the initial keynote to kick us off. This is the 50th anniversary of Lau, but there's more work to be done now than ever. I think our panelists and the keynote laid that very clearly. There's a call to action. There's something that needs to be done and needs to be done today, tomorrow, the next day. And so I think it's not just a single prong approach, right? I think there's been a lot of examples provided, although there's some limitations currently with the litigation. Selena reminded us that there are different pathways to think about this at the state level and trying to make changes, especially given our current context. Policy is more important. Policy that impacts the opportunities and the teaching and learning that that happens inside of the classroom. The practice, what happens at the leadership level, what happens at the teacher level, those are the folks that are actually making sort of what is called the living law, right? It's going above and beyond. And I think Carlene sort of made that sort of case, and Pedro and Michael as superintendents and leaders as well. And we need advocacy, meaning there needs to be advocacy at the local, state, and federal level. And I think a lot of our panelists, from Chantel to Marta, is an example of that. And research needs to be part of the equation. It was mentioned throughout, the work that Magali and Trish and Christina and others have mentioned. So I guess my parting words to all of us is that we need to be more engaged, more involved in whatever sphere across those different levels that we can. And I just want to commend all of you for attending this webinar. I know it was long, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And again, I'm super appreciative of the talented group of panelists and keynotes that we had. Again, thank you also to Dean Ganley and Claremont Graduate University and the School of Educational Studies. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Oscar.
Thank you, Oscar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.